getting ready for a bunch of tests next week. This class, the test is on Friday. If you're in Pentateuch or History of Missions, it's on Wednesday. So I was a little confused even myself as to when everything is happening. But I'm glad for that because it gives me an extra day in here, so I feel much more relaxed, at least for this class. So everything's good, unless you have other plans. So let's pray. Father, we do pray that your special grace is here and that you are not only with us, but with those who are learning and with every one of our guests. We pray that you will be with us and help us as we serve you and learn about the history of the United States and understand your blessing and grace in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so thinking of the 1960s as sort of the high watermark, at least in the 20th century for political liberalism. It's also when we would think of the modern conservative political movement has begun, and probably 1968 is the really birthing of that, with the rise of George Wallace and a few of his independent candidacy. But one could also say that Barry Goldwater, as the Republican nominee in 1968 or 1964, really was important with that too, because Goldwater is elected or nominated by the Republicans partly because Nelson Rockefeller, who was the liberal Republican, his son was born only a few days before the California primary in '64. And that reminded everyone of the fact that this child was sort of the product of an affair that he had had with his secretary, and then he divorced his wife and married her. And California at that time was a pretty conservative place, and helped Goldwater win the '64 primary, and that really changed the course of conservative politics. Here are two other people. We mentioned William F. Buckley, who was the founder of the National Review and was a member of the Conservative Party in New York. Also, backlash against social change and disruption also was seen by these two women. Phyllis Schlafly, who will create Eagle Forum, and was maybe a state legislator in Illinois. She might have been a member of the House of Delegates, House of Representatives, whatever you want to call it. But she was a single-handedly stopped the Equal Rights Amendment from getting passed in Illinois, and then prevented other states from passing it so that it never reached the threshold of 38 states prior to before it expired. And this lady, Anita Bryant, who you can see with her orange juice, she was the corporate spokesperson for Florida Orange Juice, a former Miss America and Miss Florida. But she was also an outspoken opponent of the ERA and pro-life and so forth. And in some ways, she became a liability almost for the orange industry. Florida eventually had to squeeze her out of employment because they were afraid that she was too political. Now, religion also has its interesting things in the 60s and 70s. Trouble in religious mainstream, and also there's a new resurgence of Christian broadcasting. Fuller, who we talked about earlier, Charles Fuller, is from out in California, and his programs, if you ever can find them, I don't know if they're on YouTube, you might be able to check, I'm sure they are, but they are really good. Most of them are in black and white because they were from the 50s and maybe early 60s, but they're great programs. And of course, It's his legacy that creates Fuller University, Fuller Seminary, and so forth. But there's a lot of this sort of thing. American Catholicism is definitely changing. Pope John Paul the 23rd convened Vatican II as a conference to try and modernize the church. Now, he was a fairly old man when he became pope, and he was just supposed to sort of be a placeholder pope. You know, like they're kind of short on pope candidates, so they're going to put this older guy in who won't do much, and yet he convenes the largest conference of Catholic clergy since the Council of Trent. So for hundreds of years, they hadn't had such a huge convention. And Vatican I in the 1870s had established the idea that certain statements of the Pope were infallible. So there was thought that there would never be another, why would you need another big convention? The Pope could just make statements. So he has, he doesn't actually live long enough to see it come to its end. And during the council, they elect Pope Paul VI to replace him. He was very conservative, pro-life, opposed contraception, which would still be official Catholic positions, denounced nuclear proliferation, and was against the charismatic movement within Catholicism. Other religious movements that developed, transcendental meditation among especially Eastern religions became more popular, especially after the Beatles went to India to study under the Maharaji and such during one of their times when they were trying to find themselves. So that was interesting. The Unification Church, or the Moonies, which was a interesting perversion of traditional Presbyterianism, which is very strong in Korea, especially in Northern Korea. The International Society of the Krishna Consciousness, or the Hare Krishnas, here they are, rather excited. Members at one time could be seen at airports in their traditional costumes, handing out tracts and things. Not as much now as maybe they were in the 60s and 70s. Probably another interesting movement, though, was this, Jonestown. That's founded in the 1970s. It was, and this is where the concept of a cult or religion or something as being dangerous or deviant comes into the public sphere. No one would have thought about this before. Jim Jones, who you see there holding up his, whatever it is, hymnal or something, was a Disciples of Christ minister from Anderson, Indiana, and loosely affiliated with them, and created, especially in its early days, a very socially conscious, multiracial church in Indiana that was Pentecostal in its orientation and was at least within the framework of traditional Protestantism. Eventually, he came to the conclusion that the world was going to be destroyed by nuclear weapons. And for whatever reason, Indiana seemed to be a dangerous place. So he decides to move to where he thinks is the least likely place in the United States for there to be a nuclear bomb dropped, and that was San Francisco. It happened to be that there was an article in the National Review that analyzed this, and Redwood Falls, California, which is just north of San Francisco, was said to be a safe place. Why Anderson, Indiana, or Indianapolis, or something like that would be more likely to get nuked than over there, I don't know. But nonetheless, they moved out there in buses, the whole church, everyone. And when they finally got there, this became somewhat of a church full of social justice, trying to find racial harmony. But there was a lot of sexual misconduct and abuse and other things going on behind the scenes, and yet at the same time, he had very loyal following. These people were very involved in politics, and he got elected to the planning commission, or like the zoning board. And those meetings, which are normally not very well attended, or even who cares, he would bring all of his followers in. And when he would come in, to take a seat, they would all cheer him and make his decisions. He became very, very connected to the Democratic Party there. And if you wanted to guarantee to have a group of people to show up at a rally, you contact Jim Jones. In fact, Walter Mondale, when he was running for president or vice president in 1976, met with him out there in California to help bring in support. So he was seen as pretty much legitimate, almost right to the end. But there was an article in Western Magazine, a magazine about in the West, that was going to show some of the corruption that was going on there. And so they decided to move once again to a jungle encampment that they created in the jungle of Guyana. And I mean, in the middle of the jungle. You fly into Georgetown, and then you'd have to go out by truck into the middle of the jungle. And that's where they built this camp. And it was somewhat impressive as to what they were able to accomplish there. But eventually, they went down there. They were sort of trapped there. And there were relatives of some of the people who were there that thought that their children, sons, daughters, whatever, were being held against their will. And there were fences around it, and there were armed guards, but those guards were not there to protect them from anyone who would be running through the jungle to try and kill them, but to make sure they didn't leave. Congressman Leo Ryan, who represented the area of San Francisco that the church was originally in, and a group of journalists and TV people and such went down there to do a fact-finding tour. And while they were there, they found that there were some people who wanted to leave. And this sort of sent Jim Jones over the edge. He had been losing it mentally for some time, was taking lots of drugs and things. And then this idea that there were people who wanted to leave just kind of set him over the edge. And he orchestrated at the airstrip where they were getting ready to leave, that a group of their people would go out there and murder the congressman and tried to kill all of the people who were trying to leave and some of the journalists and so forth. They did not accomplish that, but they did kill the congressman and some of the other people. And you can still see video of this online, the attack, because it was filmed by NBC News correspondents who were there recording the events. And the cameraman was actually shot while filming it. Back at Jonestown, he either inspired or contributed to the deaths of over 900 of the people that were there in a mass suicide attempt by feeding them cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. And they all either drank it or they were forced to drink it. A lot of the children were there were lots and lots of children that were injected with the poison, either voluntarily or involuntarily. This was done on the theory that the military, because of what happened to the congressman, they would all come in and kill them all anyway, so we might as well do this and make a statement about the inhumanity of man and die in this suicide attempt. There were a few people who did survive that hid or escaped. But this happened in 1978, and I can remember when this news broke in 78. I was 6 years old when that happened. And it really created a whole new way of looking at, this weirdo group over here. Because in before that, weirdo groups over there were just weirdo groups over there. No one ever thought about something like this. Leo Ryan is the only member of Congress who was ever killed in his official line of duty, because he was there on business. Even when there were some Puerto Rican activists that actually invaded the Capitol and shot bullets down into the House chamber in the 1950s, hitting 5 members of Congress, none of them were killed. So no other congressman was ever killed in performing his duties, except for them. Here's some other people from the 60s and 70s. Evangelical revival and the rise of the religious right. And I can remember this too. Into the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, television preaching became mainstream. And there were far more independent stations that had time to sell. So you would see religious broadcasting on much more stations. Jerry Falwell, who creates Liberty University and so forth, will begin with the Thomas Road Baptist Church, which was just a small little Baptist church in Lynchburg. And if you go there, you can see on the one corner is the original building, and then it's just kind of like, this is the bigger building, and this is the biggest building. And then there's, woo, back there, the real big building. So it just it was at one time America's fastest growing church. His father was a bootlegger, a person who used to do and he said, I just used the same kind of techniques my grandpa did, selling moonshine and so forth. I'm just very winsome in spreading the gospel. And was extremely successful. Went on television with the Old Time Gospel Hour, which I can remember watching, and seeing the inset lady that would always put everything into sign language. That was even fun to watch. Then we had the Moral Majority. He created a political organization in the late 1970s that helped to some degree get Jimmy Carter elected, but definitely Ronald Reagan, that embraced the religious right of politics. And it was a combination of evangelicals and conservative Catholics and Jews. And I would imagine that today they would have brought in Muslims and whoever else that would have promoted something like, traditional marriage or pro-life. And regardless of your religious background, they would have brought them into that sort of organization. And so it was kind of a way of interfacing with people who would agree on political issues, even if their religious background or denomination was different. And he founded that, the Moral Majority. The Pentecostal revival, as it relates to televangelism, there are 3 individuals. Now, the one that I don't have up here is Pat Robertson. He's still alive, by the way. I just felt he may not be out much, but he's in his 90s. But Pat Robertson was definitely on the cutting edge of this back in the 1960s, maybe even into the 50s. He started what was then called the Christian Broadcasting Network. And what he wanted was to create a Christian television network and news outfit that would be sort of a rival to the large multimedia conglomerate. And he also has a university and other things in Virginia Beach, Virginia, where his headquarters was. And his main television program is the 700 Club. That's a club of people who give $700. The 700 Club. I don't know if that's still on television or not, but it was the 700 Club that hired Jim and Tammy Baker when they were young to host the 700 Club, and it was his idea to turn that into sort of a nighttime talk show format like you would see on the Johnny Carson show. And you would have him just talking to whomever, his version of Ed McMahon, and bring in a guest and have a discussion with them around on couches, and then a musical guest and maybe a comic and someone promoting their book or whatever the case may be. And then you'd throw in some vignettes about Christianity, and that was wildly popular. They also did a television children's show with puppets that I must say was really good. The Jim and Tammy show in the early stage, they were really good at that. He will then break away from the 700 Club and takes with them a series of their television network, and then started his own group in South Carolina, North Carolina, Charlotte, the PTL Club, praise the Lord, PTL. And had many, many clubs. The 1100 Club, that was $1,100. The various clubs, inflation, it's going up. But I will tell you this, people talk about raising money. I mean, he would have like the 1100 Club or the $1,000 club, and created Heritage USA, which was a theme park in the 70s that rivaled Disney World. It was, in 1986, the third most attended theme park in America, with only Disney World and Disneyland being better. And it was even advertised as like a Christian Disneyland, where you could go to the water park in the morning and the Passion Play in the afternoon and revival service at night. And where he got himself in trouble was, to some degree, maybe selling more hotel rooms than he had. But what he would do is, you give me $1,000, and then I will give you a voucher that is worth, or that can be redeemed for 3 days and 4 nights at my theme park for the rest of your life annually. And you didn't actually buy that. You gave me a gift of $1,000, and then because you did that, I'm giving you a gift. Well, if you were looking at it as though you were buying a timeshare, let's say, then he never actually built, he sold more rooms than he had. But people sell more gym memberships than they have, because most people, when they buy a gym membership, after a while, they don't go to the gym anymore. I mean, if everyone showed up at once, yeah, maybe you couldn't use the rowing machine if you wanted to. But that wasn't the case in this case. But this is money making. If he got $1,000 from 100,000 people, that's $100 million. And he could easily do that. Because his television audience is big. And sometimes there's a YouTube channel that plays some of his old programs. And in the late 1986 and early 1987, it's sort of like a situation where he overexpanded and committed himself too much, and he just couldn't pull it off. And then he diverted money into his own pocket, because if it was going down, he was going to get his. But he eventually went under because of that. They have divorced, and he's still alive. I found out that he has a new church and a new program in Branson, Missouri, but his wife has passed away. Jimmy Swaggart, on the other hand, was from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and both of these two, they were Assembly of God preachers, and it was a big blow. They had both been caught in some sexual misconduct. Jim Bakker's issue was not really as big a deal, but Jimmy Swaggart was really, and I'm not sure what to think about what's still going on, because he was caught multiple times with prostitutes and so forth. It wasn't like he had a girlfriend, or had a one-night stand with someone. It was multiple issues in very dangerous situations. And yet he had a church, which was the largest Assembly of God church in Louisiana, in Baton Rouge. It seated 5,000 people, and his ministry over the television went around the world. It was the most watched program of any person. And I'm told he's back on the air again and doing television. By the way, he is a cousin to Jerry Lee Lewis, the rock and roll singer, and Jimmy Dean, the sausage man. They're all cousins. So one can do the preaching and one can do the music and the other can do the potluck. So they would work out great together. And since they were born in the same town as Howard Cosell, the famous broadcaster, they could all get together and just have fun. Yeah. Now, mainstream culture. Television. Some of the more important series were the Beverly Hillbillies and Petticoat Junction, and those that all flow out of that. Basic, Green Acres, they're all interconnected. The Andy Griffith Show, Bonanza, and then All in the Family, which was very provocative for its day. And I don't think could get made today because it would be considered too offensive, what was being said. Even though the people who created it were doing all of that to try and overcome the stereotypes and racism and all of that, that it presented. And then the miniseries Roots, which was groundbreaking. For movies, The Sound of Music probably was one of the more popular movies from that time period. My Fair Lady, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which combated stereotypes of interracial dating. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was a young lady, she's inviting her boyfriend and he's going to be an African American, but her parents don't know that, and how they deal with that issue. And then probably the celebrated movie of the counterculture during that time was Easy Rider. Now, music, country music grew in popularity as well, moving from a regional popularity in the South, in Nashville and in the South, to, with the Grand Ole Opry becoming more accessible as a radio show around the country, it became much more common. And also there's a division now between country and Western music and maybe bluegrass, which was more traditional. And it became something that was more popular in the general population. Sports. Jack Nicklaus, who will become the most famous golfer during this period. O.J. Simpson was the first football player to rush for 2,000 yards, and he plays for the Buffalo Bills early on, and then eventually the San Francisco 49ers. He was the Heisman Trophy winner from USC. And his story is fascinating, and how just his whole life story and the racial component of what's going on in LA at the time, and how he breaks out of that and almost becomes, becomes almost indistinguishable from the white society that he surrounded himself with. And then during his trial for murder, he is completely remade again. So it's a his life story is just fascinating. Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali. He's from right here in Kentucky, Louisville, named after Cassius Clay, who was a famous abolitionist from here in Kentucky. Because his family, historically, the African slaves, of which the slaves his family comes from here in Kentucky, were liberated due to the intervention of Cassius Clay, the original Cassius Clay from back during the Civil War. And so they named him after him. He took the name Clay from him, but he got the gold medal in boxing in 1960. And then on the very day that he defeats Sonny Liston to become the heavyweight champion of the world, he will announce to the press that he is no longer to be called Cassius Clay, that he is changing his name to Muhammad Ali, and converts to the Nation of Islam. He refuses to serve in the army during the Vietnam era when he was drafted, and as a result, flees the country to Canada and then goes around the world, and he is stripped of his title in 1967. But he will be reinstated by the Boxing Commission as long as he doesn't come back to America, and his fights in other places, like in the Congo, the Rumble in the Jungle, and various other places, and will gain his title back. Then, after Jimmy Carter pardons all of the draft dodgers right at the end of his presidency from the Vietnam era, he was able to come home and retires as the greatest of all time. At least he says he was. And he definitely was a great boxer. He knocks out Sonny Liston. He knocks out George Foreman. There's a few others of those major boxing names from that period. And I don't believe that he was beaten. I think he quits as the champion at the end, because his first time he lost the title is because it was stripped from him. He didn't lose. And then he, I think, voluntarily retires before he is beaten there at the end. Sometimes when that happens, you can't get matches anymore because everyone knows they can't beat you. And so sometimes after a while, they decide to retire. And he certainly was impacted enough. Go to Louisville, you can see all of the memorials to him, and it's certainly worthwhile for that as an issue. Okay. Looking at the political side of the 1960s, we can say that the 1960s was definitely a new era for liberal politics. We have come out of Eisenhower in the 1950s. He was a liberal Republican. But we're entering into a new era. And here are the candidates in 1960. Republican Richard Nixon, who was the vice president of the United States at that time, had served 8 years as vice president, had been a senator from California and a representative there, and a war veteran, and was relatively young. He's older than Kennedy, but he's relatively young. He was born in 1908. So people make a big deal about the fact that Kennedy is the first person born in this century, or in the 20th century, to become president, but that would have been true of Nixon too, if he had won. So he was born 1908, 1916 for Kennedy. Democrats nominate John F. Kennedy. Lyndon Johnson will be his vice presidential running mate. Lyndon Johnson was the Democratic leader at that time, and expected to be president, expected to be nominated. He could not figure out how a man who'd never said 2 intelligible sentences in the Senate could be so popular among the voters. Maybe because he was young and handsome. That might have helped. But Lyndon Johnson is the number 2 man. Kennedy was afraid that he needed help in the South in order to get Democratic support for him to run, and that if he was seen as a New England liberal, that the Republicans might nominate someone who would be more popular in the South, and Nixon certainly was popular in the South. So they brought in Lyndon Johnson. Of course, he's from Texas, and he was well known as a person who gets things done in the Senate. Bobby Kennedy does not like Lyndon Johnson at all, and he tries to get Johnson to back out of accepting the vice presidency. And this creates friction between Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Kennedy for the rest of their lives. So Johnson will eventually become vice president. Now, he doesn't like being vice president, though, because being vice president means you basically have no power at all. He hoped that he would still be the chair of the Democratic caucus in the Senate as vice president, because he had already been their leader. And the Democratic senators said no. He's now part of the executive branch. He is not going to be the Democratic leader. And so the vice president has no voice in the Senate, can only vote in the case of a tie. And so really, he was not happy as vice president. But the thing that really makes this stand out is the fact that these were the first time that debates between presidential candidates were televised. Now, there may have been debates before, but they were only over the radio. Nixon was suffering from an infection because he had hurt his knee, having it slammed in a car door while traveling, and he was on medication for that, the infection, and he just did not understand television. He decided that he would not have any makeup on when he went in before the cameras, not knowing that it would just bleach him out, and he's perspiring, and he looks faded, and he's a little pale anyway because he's not feeling great. John Kennedy has been riding around California in his convertible, campaigning, bronzed, and is willing to have makeup and is just energetic, and he looks and acts young and is just a much more impressive figure to look at. Today, this mistake would never be allowed, but they just let Nixon do this. They had 3 debates, but the first one was the most important. The radio audience, when polled, gave Nixon the edge in listening to what they said. But the largest television audience to ever watch a debate, even today, gave the advantage to Kennedy, primarily because of his appearance. And this is true about so much in politics. How you look is so important. One of the things back when Bill Clinton was challenging George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, he could just give a semblance of empathy in the crowd. And George Bush did something that was a big mistake. He looked at his watch several times during the debate, which gave people the impression that he had a meeting that he needed to get to when the debate was over, or whatever the case may be. Like he really wasn't into it, and he shouldn't have done that. Ask her, well, let's see what time it is. Oh yeah, I can answer your question. Like, are you disengaged? Al Gore is said to have turned off especially older female voters by the way he rolled his eyes after George Bush said certain things during the debate, which was caught on camera, as though he was making fun of him or humiliating him or whatever the case may be. That kind of impression you would never know if you were listening to these debates on radio. Makes a big difference. There was some interesting, this was a very close vote. Kennedy won by only 119,000 votes. That is less than 1 vote per precinct all across the country. Now, of course, we don't elect people by popular vote, it's by electoral college. He carried only 21 out of the 50 states. But you carry the ones with the most electoral votes and you're going to win. Fraud was suspected in Lyndon Johnson's Texas. Fraud was always suspected in Lyndon Johnson's Texas. Lyndon Johnson would not have gotten elected if there wasn't fraud going on. Now, he didn't have anything to do with it. But there's good evidence that in his first campaign for the Senate, there were all kinds of illegal votes being stuffed into the ballot box, not because they liked him, but because they didn't want someone else elected. And also Chicago, where you vote early and often, even if you're dead. I mean, some people, I voted 9 times for Kennedy. Chicago was rife with fraud. Some precincts, many more people voted than lived in the area. So there's good evidence that there was fraud there. Nixon almost challenged the results, similar to the way Al Gore did or the way President Trump is trying to look for fraud, but feared that if he didn't find enough fraud to overturn the election, that the country would be destroyed. And he was young enough to run again, which he will get to be president later. And if he isn't found correct, the accusation of sore loser will go with him. But there's good reason to think that there was some fraud going on. Not that Kennedy had anything to do with it, but there is good evidence that Kennedy's dad, Joseph Kennedy, used his connections with the underground organized crime, because the Kennedys made their money running illegal booze across the Canadian border in Detroit during Prohibition. So he knew the people in Chicago who could turn an election, the people. And then after Kennedy got elected, one of the things he and Bobby does is go after organized crime. And there was sort of an agreement between Joe Kennedy and these people that they would be left alone if they helped. And some think that may be why Kennedy could have been killed, that there's more than one thing going on, that the mob got him because they were getting back at him for breaking this agreement, which of course he knew nothing about. So anyway, election of 1960. One of the things Kennedy really wants to do is develop the new frontier. He was young, the youngest person ever elected president, 43 years of age. Not the youngest president to serve, but the youngest elected. And he was the second son of Irish Catholic from Boston, Joseph P. Kennedy and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. The best and brightest came to serve his administration. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, who had been the CEO of Ford Motor Company. Dean Risk, Rhodes Scholar and head of the Ford Foundation, was Secretary of State. Arthur Schlesinger, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist from Harvard and Harvard historian, will serve as his press secretary. Robert Kennedy, his brother, probably the weakest of the bunch, was Attorney General. That was what his dad wanted. I want Bobby to be Attorney General. And then McGeorge Bundy was National Security Advisor. One of his main things to start was the space program. Now, it already existed, but he promoted this scientific on national security grounds. Think of all the things we can invent that will be used for the military if we develop a space program. The Russians had already put a satellite in orbit, Sputnik, and then the first one to put a living thing in space, a dog, which was nicknamed Mutnik. And it did come back alive. And then a human being. And we, in the beginning, couldn't do anything right. I mean, we found out 1,000 ways to blow up a rocket. but we couldn't launch one. I mean, it was a mess. Eventually, we will get satellites and we will send John Glenn into space and so forth. But in order to beat the Russians, he knew we needed a goal they couldn't match. And so, after John Glenn orbited the Earth in Friendship 7 on February 20th, 1962, Kennedy will say that before the end of this decade, before the end of the 1960s, we propose to go to the moon and bring the astronaut back safely to the Earth. And that was huge. I mean, the space program really didn't know anything about it. He's just there making the speech, how we're going to go to the moon and come back and be successful. And we've accomplished that. Of course, we haven't been to the moon since, I don't know, 1974 or something like that. Maybe it's time to go back. Is it necessary? I don't know. He was a Reaganite when it came to taxes. Supply side person. I'm not sure what Kennedy treatment he would get if he was running for the Democratic nomination today. This is before Roe versus Wade, so it's hard to know as a Catholic what his position on abortion would be. He would probably be one of those that would say, I'm against it personally. This is an early Catholic doctrine, way you get around. I'm against it myself personally, but I won't tell someone else what they have to believe. So I would imagine he would have come down on that. But certainly his brother was definitely pro-life when Robert Kennedy had like 11 kids. So the Kennedys were definitely strong Catholics. But he was for reduced taxes to stimulate the economy, similar to what George Bush does, Reagan does. He was a supply-side economic person. Trade expansion and reduced unemployment. So he believed in free trade, reducing regulations, and doing what you can to bring down unemployment. He probably would have not been a radical on abortion. He was an anti-communist fighter. Today, he'd almost seem like a Republican. It would be interesting if a Kennedy-like Democrat arrived on the scene, something like Tulsi Gabbard, who looks pretty conservative. Civil rights. Kennedy takes this on firmly. The University of Mississippi was integrated. James Meredith, in his home in Jackson, Mississippi, is being restored as a National Historic Site, so I wouldn't mind seeing that someday. But he was enrolled at the University of Mississippi. Governor Ross Barnett incited a riot on the campus that resulted in several deaths and injuries to National Guardsmen in an attempt to stop this. In Alabama, Governor George Wallace stood in front of the schoolhouse door to prevent the enrollment of an African American. Now, George Wallace is a very interesting figure. George Wallace is well known for his statement when he was elected governor in the 60s, somewhere in there, 62, something like that, by saying segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And yet, when he was a federal judge, he was very liberal on the issue of race. And when he ran for governor the first time, he lost the Democratic nomination because he was out segregated by his opponent. And he said, I could do that as well as anybody. I mean, so it was almost like an act he put on to get white votes in Alabama. But his policies as governor were black friendly. In fact, when blacks could vote later on, he got the majority of the black vote, even with all of his racial statements. And at the end of his career, when he became governor in the 80s, he was an integrationist. He's a fascinating figure. But here's a picture of him. This is the governor there. And here is the Attorney General's representative informing him that he is to give way. And he gets the letter, and here's and behind him are a whole bunch of National Guard troops that are going to see to it that these students can enroll at the University of Alabama. And he does give way. They do get in. It's for political show. And he uses his contacts with the Ku Klux Klan to see to it there are no riots while this is going on, no violence. Because he didn't want anything to disrupt this. This was for political show only. If there was violence, that would be a problem. Then the National Guard would really come in. So wanted to stop that. So that's George Wallace, and then we will deal with other things later. So right now we're done. You've got lunch in 5 minutes.
Yes.
So eat fast and then do whatever you do next.